The second part of this video is going to be about Morse code. But in the first part, I'm going to return to the subject of the Krogers, the spies that I described in the previous video, and how it all started from a tip-off by the CIA in America. Hello, and thank you for joining the Waters and Stanton video channel. My name's Peter Waters and my amateur radio call sign is Golf 3 Oscar Juliet Victor. And as I said in the introduction, the second part of this video is going to be about Morse code. So if you're thinking about Morse code, wondering whether it's worth learning or whether it has anything to offer you, then stick with this video because I'm going to talk about it. And of course we are actually at the moment as we shoot this video starting to enter the Christmas break, and of course it's a very unusual break this year because of the COVID outbreak. But I've had so many emails and inquiries about the Krogers that I covered in the previous video. I thought that perhaps I should really go back to the beginning and explain how it all started and how it all ended. So it all started in America. The CIA had a mole who was apparently a triple agent, and at the time he was operating in Russia. And it came to his attention that documents relating to the Admiralty Weapons Development Establishment in Portland were reaching Russia. There was no other information, that was it. But documents relating to the Admiralty development work, primarily on submarines, was reaching Russia. Well, the CIA obviously couldn't do much with it there, so they passed this information across to MI5. And MI5 decided that the first port of call would be Portland to see if they could ascertain any information that Portland and the Admiralty had to offer them. With spies, there are usually some clues as to who might be a spy, and their suspicion fairly quickly fell on somebody called Harry Houghton. Now, Harry Houghton had been a sailor and he'd left the operational side of the Navy and was working as a clerk in the Admiralty. And the reason that suspicion fell upon him was that his lifestyle didn't match his rather meagre wages that he was receiving. He had 4 cars, he'd bought a new house, and he was quite a regular drinker. And it was quite common for him to buy everybody in the pub a free round of drinks. So it was quite natural that MI5 should think, well, where is the money coming from? Now, in those days, we're going back to 1959, in those days it was not easy to trace money. There was a lot of cash dealings. You couldn't get into people's bank accounts very easily because it wasn't computerized, and it was very easy to spend cash. You could buy a car for cash. You could probably buy a house for cash, actually. There were no restrictions as there are today. So MI5 would not have been able to trace the origin of the money. And despite all this money that Harry Houghton seemed to have, his job didn't give him access to any confidential documents. So there had to be either another person to look at, or there had to be more information that MI5 needed to gather about this guy Harry. Well, they stuck at it, and it didn't take them very long to ascertain that Harry had a mistress, Ethel G. Now, Ethel G was a young lady who was a filing clerk, but she did have access to confidential documents because she had access to the library, the Admiralty Library, where all these confidential documents were kept. That started to put part of the jigsaw puzzle together. Could Harry and Ethel be working together? Well, it's one thing having a suspicion. It's quite another thing trying to prove it. And one of the things that MI5 wanted to do was they wanted to get to the bottom of this, but they didn't want to cause any suspicion on the part of Ethel or Harry that they were being spied on, because that would have broken the chain, and they really wanted to find out the complete chain before they were to take any action and consider arresting anybody. So they decided to follow Ethel and Harry and look at their social life. And it wasn't long before they found that Ethel and Harry made regular trips to London. These trips seemed to be one purpose, and for one purpose only: to meet a Mr. Lonsdale, Gordon Lonsdale. But as far as MI5 could find out initially, was Gordon Lonsdale was selling jukeboxes and bubblegum machines and travelling around the country doing so. On the face of it, not the sort of guy that would make any sense. Why would they meet somebody who was selling bubblegum machines and jukeboxes? So MI5 decided that they should put a tail on Gordon Lonsdale. And they found that amongst his travels, he was a regular visitor to a bungalow in Ruislip, in Middlesex, near London. And this is part of the story that I covered in the previous video. So MI5 decided to put a watch on the bungalow. But it still didn't get them very far, because they had a couple working in the Admiralty who could be taking the documents. They had somebody in London that could be a contact. And why was he going to this bungalow in Ruislip in Middlesex? Was it a friend? So MI5 switched their attention back to Harry and Ethel. And it didn't take them too long to find out that at these meetings in London, the couple were passing something, a parcel of something, to Gordon Lonsdale. That was probably their big breakthrough. There was a connection there. There was a reason for going to London. What was in that package? And in these investigations, there comes a point where a chance has to be taken. MI5 wanted to make sure that they didn't cause any suspicion to all the parties involved, because as soon as it was obvious that MI5 were onto them, then everything had to happen pretty quickly. So MI5 decided at the next meeting, if there was a package passed to Lonsdale, they would intercept. Now at the time, MI5 didn't have the power of arrest, so they took with them 2 special branch officers. And they followed Harry and Ethel to London, and they saw them about to pass some packages to Lonsdale. And that's when they pounced. Special branch arrested the pair on suspicion, and in Ethel G's shopping bag they found photographs and documents relating to the Admiralty work, confidential documents. So MI5 knew that they were working in the right direction. But of course they had to work pretty quickly now, because what was this connection with the bungalow in Ruislip in Middlesex? So the next task was to dash up there before anybody could arouse the warning signs to whoever was in the bungalow that MI5 were onto them. MI5 and Special Branch needed to get into that bungalow and quickly. So they decided to pose as police officers investigating local burglaries. And then knocked on the door, and apparently they were invited in without any problem at all. Once inside, they declared that they were MI5 and they wanted to carry out investigations and search of the premises, and the Krogers, Helen and Peter, were going to be arrested. Helen said that she needed to stoke the boiler to make sure the heating kept on. This was actually in the heart of winter. Well, MI5 weren't going to fall for that one, and they took a handbag and looked inside, and they found microdots and other pieces of information that quite clearly she was going to throw on the boiler. So they were arrested and taken away to Scotland Yard, and a search began of the premises, and they found all sorts of evidence there, photographic equipment, and they found a certain amount of money and evidence of transmission equipment and so forth. Although at the time they didn't seem to find the transmitter. It actually took them several days before they actually uncovered the transmitter or transceiver. And I know that one or two people that watched this video, watched the last video, said that all they needed to do was to communicate to the Russian embassy in London. Well, it wasn't the case at all. This equipment was quite clearly used to transmit directly to Moscow. It was fairly high powered, operated on the shortwave frequencies, and because of skip distance, it would have been totally impossible to communicate to London on the shortwaves. The ground wave would have been too short and the skip distance too long. No, they were communicating direct to Moscow and using microdots in books, and I covered this in the previous video. So the jigsaw puzzle was complete. It was Harry Houghton and Ethel G, Lonsdale and the Krogers. That was the chain of events. The Krogers were sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. They were released after 10 years on an exchange with a British captive, which was quite common in that period to exchange prisoners. So the Krogers went back to Moscow and they were given a KGB pension, and the wife died in 1995, and the alias Peter Kroger died 2 years later in 1997. Harry Houghton and Ethel G were sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. They came out after 10 years and they married. Ethel died in 1985 in Poole in Dorset, and Harry died 2 years later. And as for Lonsdale, Gordon Arnold Lonsdale, well, that wasn't his real name. It turned out that he was actually born in Moscow, and although he went to America for a period of time for his education, which of course gave him good command of English, and his American accent that he would have developed would have passed certainly over in the UK as a Canadian accent, because he purported to be a Canadian businessman. He was actually a Russian intelligence officer, and the Gordon Arnold Lonsdale did actually exist, but he died in 1943. The Russians obtained all the necessary paperwork, prepared false passports, and that enabled the alias Gordon Arnold Lonsdale to come and work in the UK, albeit illegally. He died quite early. He was sentenced, but he was released from prison after 7 years and another exchange of prisoners. He went back to Russia in 1967 and 3 years later died at the age of 48. There was a lot of radio equipment involved. The house of the Krogers was found to contain quite a large amount of money, and they found some more radio equipment in there. And the house of Harry and Ethel was found to contain a large amount of money. But most of that money they didn't actually keep. So that's the story. Let's get on to amateur radio and a different form of code. Not a secret code, but nevertheless a code, Morse code. It's one of these Marmite occasions again, isn't it? You either like it or you don't like it, but very often you don't like it because you haven't really thought too seriously about it. You know, Morse code was used way before radio. Samuel Morse came up with an idea of a code, and it was used to communicate using wire, and there was styluses at one end of the wire chain that would sort of make holes in paper or whatever it was. And Samuel Morse had this code that he wanted to use to make communications, because there was no voice communication. It had to be sort of some sort of code. And in actual fact, Morse code was really the first form of data. So he had this great idea about a code, but he actually got it wrong, because his idea was that each word would would have a number. So he came up with this idea of numbers. Each word would have a number. So hello would have a number, goodbye would have a number, can you hear me would have a number, no I can't hear you would have a number. But somebody must have tapped him on the shoulder and said, look Samuel, I don't think you got this right. Have you really thought about how many words there are in the English dictionary? It was obvious that Samuel Morse's idea of a code was quite good, but the implementation of that code was totally wrong. And it was explained to him in a quiet corner, I suspect, look, if we have a code for each letter of the alphabet, it's going to make things easier, because there's only 26 letters in the English alphabet. So why don't we have a code for each letter? And I don't know what Samuel Morse, he probably said, yes, I was thinking about that myself, actually. So the Morse code was developed such that you had a code for each letter of the alphabet, and you also had a code for numbers, and you had a code for punctuation and that sort of thing. So that's how Morse code started. And of course, when radio came along, it was the natural transition from that code to be used for radio transmission, because in the early days all they could do was generate a signal. So if they were to interrupt that signal in a way that carried some sort of meaning, some sort of information, then you could communicate with radio. And so the first form of communication by radio was using Morse code, and that's lasted for 70 or 80 years. Certainly it was part of the amateur radio requirement until I think the mid-50s. You had to have a period of Morse code I think you had to be on the air for 2 years with Morse code before you could transmit phone signals. And then later on, when I was first licensed, you had to have a 12 word per minute test before you could get your amateur radio license, but you could actually go on phone immediately. When you actually think about Morse code, it was quite an interesting way to develop a means of communication just by switching something on and off. They could have had sort of 2 dots, 3 dots, 4 dots, 5 dots, groups of 10 dots. But the idea of having dots and dashes was quite a good idea, because it meant to say that it reduced the number of characters that you needed to send in order to send a letter. But not only that, it actually gave rhythm. And that really is an important part of Morse code. It's got rhythm to it. Now, I know that when you start learning Morse code, there's no sense of rhythm at all. It's dots and dashes, and you count the number of dots and you count the number of dashes. Well, that's fine if you're copying Morse at a very slow speed. But if you want to speed up, and when I say speed up, even at 10 or 12 words a minute, you need to start to get to grips with the rhythm of Morse code, because the rhythm of Morse code is really the part that carries the information. Yes, you can count the dots and the dashes, but once you start to speed up, you can't really count the dots and dashes because things happen so quickly. So you need to learn Morse code and learn the rhythm. You know, it's actually easier to send Morse code than it is to read it. And the reason is that if you're going to send Morse code, you know beforehand what you're going to send. You know you're going to send the letter V or the letter A. When you're receiving it, you don't know what you're going to receive until it's happened. And whilst you're thinking about what has just happened, the next letter has been sent, and so you suddenly find that you can't keep up. And that really is one of the reasons why you need to listen for the rhythm, because the rhythm registers much quicker than counting dots and dashes. I'm told that during the Second World War, they were able to train radio officers in a matter of a few weeks. In other words, they could take somebody that didn't have a grasp of Morse code, didn't know the Morse code at all, and within weeks they'd be able to send and receive Morse code. Well, I guess that was because it was intensive training. You spent day and night thinking and learning about Morse code. You probably counted Morse code or dots and dashes rather than counted sheep when you wanted to get to sleep. So what has Morse code got to offer amateur radio operators? Well, one of the attractions was that it's very simple. You don't need a microphone. All you need to do is to be able to generate a radio signal and interrupt it. And that really has been one of the attractions for a long time. And even during the 40s and 50s, a lot of radio communication, military-wise, and also for shipping and so forth, was done using Morse code because it was so simple. Another reason is that Morse code can actually be heard even when the signals are very weak and under noisy conditions. An experienced CW operator can actually hear very weak signals, and that is another attraction, that you can work stations using Morse code that would be impossible to achieve if you were using sideband and so forth. There is another advantage as well. You know, we tend to take for granted that English is the international language. Certainly in ham radio, you know, we expect people to speak in English. Well, that's rather arrogant of us, I suppose. But in practical terms, English is a very popular language in ham radio circles. But you don't need to speak the language if you use Morse code. All you need to do is to have a command of some basic abbreviations, and you can exchange signals and have a brief contact. We know that we have things like QRX, QSO, QRM and so forth, which are abbreviations. It doesn't take very long to learn to send your name, NAME. It doesn't take too long to learn that. Or more popularly now, it's OP, operator OP. WX is for weather, thanks is TNX. So you can have, and QTH of course, so you can have a rubber stamp QSO with somebody that really doesn't speak the same language as you do. Another feature of Morse code is, of course, it's a skill. It's a skill to learn, and it's a skill to be proud to have achieved and mastered. How do you learn Morse code? Well, in a short answer, practice. There is no shortcut to learning Morse code. I've seen all sorts of recommendations, but really and truly, unless you practice, you won't master Morse code. The first thing you need to do is to obviously learn the code, learn the alphabet. Don't worry about sending Morse code, just learn the characters. I can remember as a youngster walking along the road and translating the letters on number plates into Morse code in my head and looking at adverts and that sort of thing. You can do it in the train, you know, if you've got a book or a paper or something to read, you can translate those letters into Morse code in your head. And don't think in dots and dashes, go da, di, da, di, da. So da is a dash and dit is a dot. So C is da, di, da, dit, da, di, da, dit. That's C. So don't think of it as dash, dot, dash, dot. Think of it as da, di, da, dit, because that starts you to learn the rhythm. I'm recording this video just before the Christmas break starts. I say the Christmas break, it's a very strange time we're in at the moment, and a lot of us are spending Christmas in situations that we didn't expect. There's no great family gatherings, so it's just possible that it might be the opportunity for you to think about learning Morse code. Now, I wouldn't want to persuade anybody to learn Morse code if they didn't want to. But what I would say is that it's a part of amateur radio that you may want to consider, because it does open up a new field of ham radio. You can work stations that maybe you wouldn't otherwise work because they don't speak English. You can work stations that are right on the noise level. Now, I know you can have FT8 and so forth, but FT8 really is very much a rubber stamp QSO. CW, Morse code, does give you the opportunity of passing a bit more information. So the fact that we are confined to our homes a lot of the time for the moment may be an ideal time to learn Morse code. I learnt Morse code simply by listening to stations on the air. I did have the advantage, of course, that there was a lot more Morse code when I was a youngster than what there is now. But there are still Morse code transmissions. Some of the clubs have Morse code transmissions. Some of the radio clubs have nets. There's a local club to me that has a net on 2 meters. And there is there's some CW on YouTube, and I think there's some other channels as well. If you go onto Google, I don't think you'll find too much shortage of Morse code to listen to. There are also electronic Morse code generators. MFJ do a range of Morse code generators which you can find on our website. The point is that you do need to practice, but it's very satisfying, because what actually happens is you start to think, wait a minute, I'm getting the gist of this now. You know, I'm going to tell you a story. This is an absolute true story. About 5 or 6 years ago, in our shop in Hockley, which we've now closed, about 5 or 6 years ago, there was an elderly lady came in, and she came up to the counter and she said, "Is this the radio shop?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, where are the radios?" So I thought, well, she wanted a radio for a kitchen, so I sort of started to pick up a portable radio. No, not those, amateur radio. So I said, "Oh, well, they're over there." "Oh, can I have a look?" So I took her over there, and she saw the Ellicraft K3 and the amplifier on the desk, and she said, "Oh, do you mind if I sit down and have a try?" So I said, "No, fine." And I tuned up to the SSB section on 20 meters, which was quite active at that particular time. And I said, "Oh, I'll leave you to have a..." "Thank you very much," she said. "Thank you very much." But to my amazement, she tuned down to the CW end, and she was listening, and I thought, I'm amazed. This old lady that I thought had come into the shop to buy a portable radio for a kitchen, obviously can read CW. So I thought, I must find out more. in my mind, I thought that she must have been in the services, and that's how she learned Morse code. So anyway, I went back to her and I said, "Oh, how are you getting on?" I said, "As a matter of interest, where did you learn the Morse code? Were you in the services?" "Oh no," she said. No, she said, I was a CBer." She said, "And then I heard about amateur radio, so I took my foundation license and I taught myself CW." Well, I was quite amazed because she was listening to this CW at reasonable speed, and she was copying it okay. So there we are. She started at a fairly late time in life. So even if you're my age, it's still possible to learn Morse code. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just generate a few signals and give you the idea of how rhythm plays an important part. I can't teach you Morse code. The only person that can teach you Morse code is really yourself. You need to listen to it. You need to learn the alphabet. Once you learn the alphabet, then you can start to think about reading it. And it is very satisfying. I know some of you may have turned off by now, but it is very satisfying, and it's quite a challenge. And as I said earlier on, it's a skill to be proud of. Now, I may come back to the subject of Morse code at a later video, but let me just finish off by demonstrating how the Morse code can develop into a rhythm. I'm going to take a common thing that you're going to hear on the ham radio band, CQ, which is dash dot, and then dash dot dash. I always remember Q as "Here Comes the Bride," da 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 da. So let's send. I've set my transceiver at 6 words a minute. Let's send CQ at 6 words a minute, and you'll hear dash dot dash dot, and then dash dash dot dash. So here we go. Repeat that. That's C. That's Q. That's pretty slow, but there's no real rhythm there. So let me just increase the speed to, what are we going to go? 12 words a minute. Send CQ again. Start to get rhythm there, aren't we? CQ, they're starting to get rhythm. Let's go a bit faster so we really start to pick up the rhythm. I'll go to 18 words a minute because that's probably a fairly common operational speed. Now, if you had to count the dashes and the dots, you'd lose yourself. But can you hear a rhythm? Listen again. Now, if you get that rhythm in your head, which is not too difficult, get that rhythm in your head and then listen on the amateur bands down the CW end. I'll guarantee that you'll hear pretty well regularly. Another thing that you'll hear in QSOs is RST. So let's go back to 6 words a minute. So R is dot dash dot, then 3 dots for S, and T is a dash. That's RST. Now that probably sounds really slow in comparison with what we've just built up to in a very short period of time. So let's do it again. Not much rhythm there, that's RST. Let's do RST now at 12 words a minute. That's RST at 12 words a minute. And let's go at 18 words a minute. Can you hear a rhythm there? You should be able to hear a rhythm there. Let's do it again. That's another one. So we've got CQ and RST. CQ and RST. There we are. So, have I encouraged you to try CW or not? Maybe you've switched off by now. if you stuck with it. Thanks for watching this video. I hope it's been of interest to you. The first bit about the spies and the second bit about CW. We are in the Christmas period, or coming up to the Christmas period, so it's a great time to think about doing something that you might not have otherwise done, particularly as we seem to have more time on our hands at home and less time available to mix with our friends and relatives. So I do appreciate you supporting this channel. Don't forget to press the subscribe button if you've enjoyed these videos, and also to keep in touch, of course. And don't forget to enjoy your ham radio, even if you don't try CW. You could still do the rest of the things you've been doing on phone and FT8 and whatever. But it's a great hobby. Enjoy yourself. Take care. Keep safe. Speak soon. Bye.